Please, he whispered, his eyes darkening as he reached for my hand. The weight of his fingers against my wrist felt like shackles. I could hear my heartbeat drumming in my ears, drowning out the rational voice screaming inside my head. This wasn't what I had agreed to. This wasn't what I wanted. But there I was, frozen in place, watching as he slipped on a condom, ignoring every boundary I had tried to establish. We should not have sex, I repeated, my voice barely audible even to myself. The words hung in the air between us, acknowledged, yet dismissed with alarming ease. How had I ended up here? In a stranger's apartment, with my clothes disheveled and my dignity slipping away? Just weeks ago, I had been nursing the measured pain of a mutual breakup with a man I had loved for years. And now I was here, trapped in the consequences of what had seemed like a harmless way to move on. The dating app had promised connection, excitement, control. But in this moment, I felt none of those things. I felt small. I felt powerless. I felt the crushing weight of a lesson I was learning far too late. That sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who smile at you over coffee, who text you good morning, who say all the right things until the door closes behind you. When it was over, I dressed mechanically, my fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers. He offered to call me a ride, his voice suddenly casual, as if what had just happened between us had been mutual and uncomplicated. As if he hadn't just systematically dismantled every no I had given him. I declined, preferring to walk the 6 blocks to the main road in the gathering darkness, where I could cry without explanation, where I could try to wash away the feeling of violation with the cold evening air. I deleted the app before I even reached the corner of his street. This isn't a story about romance gone wrong. This isn't even a story about bad dates or awkward encounters. This is a story about consent, about the gray areas that shouldn't be gray at all, about the moments when politeness becomes our prison, and about what happens when someone decides your boundaries are merely suggestions. This is my story, and I'm sharing it because I wish someone had shared theirs with me before I ever swiped right. I broke up with my boyfriend of 4 years, Nathan, on a Tuesday afternoon in October. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table in the apartment we'd shared for the past 2 years, both of us calm in a way that suggested we'd emotionally checked out long before this conversation. Not just the physical absence of Nathan, but the absence of routine, of inside jokes, of having someone who knew exactly how I took my coffee, or what made me laugh until I couldn't breathe. I started staying late at the office, not because I had work to do, but because going home to an empty apartment felt like admitting defeat. It was during one of these late evenings, as I mindlessly scrolled through spreadsheets I'd already reviewed 3 times, that I noticed 2 of my colleagues, Jasmine and Madison, huddled over a phone, giggling and whispering with a kind of excitement I hadn't felt in months. Curiosity pulled me from my desk toward theirs. "What's so entertaining over here?" I asked, trying to sound casual rather than desperate for distraction. Madison looked up, her face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and delight. "Oh, just swiping through potential dates," she said, turning her phone screen toward me to reveal a grid of profile pictures. "These dating apps are addictive." Jasmine nodded enthusiastically. "I've had 3 dates this month already. One was a disaster. He showed up wearing socks with sandals." She shuddered dramatically. "But the other 2 were actually decent human beings. And tomorrow, I'm meeting this guy who looks like he belongs on the cover of Men's Health." "Really?" I asked, pulling a chair over to join them. "Do you actually meet people that way? I always thought those apps were just for, hookups." Madison finished my thought with a knowing smile. "Sure, some people use them for that. But I've met guys who want actual relationships too. It's like a buffet. You can sample a little of everything until you find what you like." "Hey, do you guys believe in social media relationships?" I asked, genuinely curious about their experiences. "Yeah, it's a nice way to meet guys, and it makes your dating game strong," Jasmine replied, scrolling through her matches with practiced ease. Madison leaned in closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I've got a date set for this weekend. He looks amazing, has abs, and looks like he's a total gym freak. Just imagine how amazing and strong he'd be in bed," she added with a suggestive wiggle of her eyebrows. I returned to my desk with their laughter following me, feeling both intrigued and slightly scandalized. I hadn't dated anyone besides Nathan since college. The idea of meeting strangers from the internet seemed foreign, almost reckless. But as I sat there, staring at my computer screen without really seeing it, I found myself wondering, why not? What did I have to lose? That night, after 3 glasses of wine and a pep talk from my sister over the phone, I downloaded one of the dating apps Jasmine had recommended. Setting up my profile felt like creating a resume for a job I wasn't sure I wanted. What pictures made me look approachable, but not desperate? What kind of bio struck the right balance between interesting and authentic? I settled on 3 recent photos. One from my brother's wedding where I was wearing a bridesmaid's dress that actually looked good, one hiking in the mountains from last summer, and one casual shot of me laughing at a friend's barbecue. For my bio, I kept it simple. Marketing professional by day, amateur chef and bookworm by night. Looking for someone who can make me laugh and introduce me to new adventures. The choice seemed suddenly weighted with significance. With a nervous laugh at my own melodrama, I swiped right, then immediately set my phone face down on the coffee table as if I'd done something illicit. 5 minutes later, when curiosity got the better of me, I picked up my phone to find 3 matches already waiting. The rush of validation was instantaneous and embarrassingly potent. 3 strangers had looked at my carefully curated photos and decided I was worth at least a conversation. It wasn't exactly a profound connection, but after months of feeling increasingly invisible, it was something. What had started as mild curiosity quickly evolved into a full-blown obsession. I found myself swiping during my morning commute, on my lunch break, while waiting for the elevator, and late at night before bed. The app became a constant companion, offering an endless stream of possibilities, each new profile a potential story waiting to unfold. Most of the conversations went nowhere. Hey beautiful, followed by increasingly explicit suggestions. Questions that revealed they hadn't bothered to read my profile. Jokes that weren't funny the first time, let alone the 5th. Of the dozens of matches I accumulated in that first week, only a handful managed to sustain a conversation beyond the initial greeting. One of those was Ryan, a software developer with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor that came through even in text. We moved quickly from dating app messages to texting, and I found myself looking forward to his name appearing on my phone. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous conversations, and never once sent an unsolicited picture of his anatomy, a bar that should have been higher than it was, given some of my other matches. We should meet, he suggested after a week of daily texting. How about coffee this weekend? I hesitated, not because I didn't want to meet him, but because meeting in person would transform this from a harmless distraction into something real, with all the vulnerability that entailed. I have a rule, I replied, typing and deleting several versions before settling on the truth. I don't meet anyone until we've talked for at least a week. Consider me properly vetted then, he responded, adding a smiling emoji. It's been exactly 7 days since our first message. I checked. His patience and attention to detail charmed me, and I agreed to meet him that Sunday at a cafe in the downtown area. As I got ready that morning, I tried to manage my expectations. We'd clicked via text, but chemistry in person was an entirely different matter. Still, I found myself taking extra care with my appearance, wearing a dress I knew complemented my figure, spending more time than usual on my makeup, and even changing my earrings 3 times before settling on a pair Nathan had once said brought out the gold flecks in my eyes. The cafe was bustling when I arrived, the weekend crowd filling nearly every table with couples and friends sharing pastries and conversation. I spotted Ryan immediately, sitting by the window with 2 coffee cups already in front of him. I hope I got your order right, he said as I approached. You mentioned loving caramel lattes last week, so I took a chance. The gesture was small but thoughtful, and I felt a flutter of optimism as I sat down across from him. In person, Ryan was more handsome than his photos had suggested, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that couldn't be captured on a screen. We fell into conversation easily, covering topics from work to family to favorite books. He was a good listener, leaning forward slightly when I spoke, his eyes never drifting to his phone or to other people in the cafe. "The way you look when a person talks, it's amazing," he commented during a lull in the conversation. "It makes the person feel that you are actually listening." I blushed at the unexpected compliment. "Oh, I'm a good listener," I replied, oddly flustered by his observation. As the afternoon wore on, however, I found myself noticing the differences between us more than the similarities. Ryan was passionate about technology and innovation, speaking animatedly about cryptocurrency and virtual reality, topics that, try as I might, I couldn't muster much enthusiasm for. When I talked about my love for 19th century literature or my dream of someday opening a small bookstore cafe, his attention seemed to waver, his responses becoming more perfunctory. By the time we hugged goodbye outside the cafe, I had a sinking feeling that despite our easy text conversations, we weren't particularly compatible in person. There was nothing wrong with Ryan. He was polite, intelligent, and objectively attractive. But the spark I'd been hoping for, the connection that would make me forget about Nathan and the comfortable familiarity we'd shared, was noticeably absent. "I had a good time meeting you," Ryan texted later that evening, as I was settling in with a glass of wine and the novel I'd been neglecting during my dating app adventures. "Me too," I replied, the polite response feeling hollow even as I typed it. "Really?" "It didn't feel like it," came his immediate reply, the text carrying a note of hurt or perhaps accusation that made me pause. "I just don't talk much," I explained, feeling a twinge of guilt. "I'm more of a listener. Plus, I was nervous," I added, offering him an out that wasn't entirely untrue. First dates were nerve-wracking, especially after years of relationship comfort. "I understand," he responded, and I hoped that would be the end of it, a mutually recognized mismatch that would fade naturally into the background of our respective lives. But the following week brought radio silence from Ryan, punctuated only by my increasingly infrequent check-ins. "How's your week going?" I'd text, only to receive a response hours or even days later. "Busy with work. Lots of meetings." The excuses were generic, the conversations stilted where they had once flowed effortlessly. I stopped initiating contact, deciding that if Ryan was interested, he would reach out. 3 days passed with no communication, and I found myself surprisingly unbothered by the silence. I'd just about written off the experience entirely when my phone lit up with his name late one Thursday evening. "Hey, let's meet tomorrow night," the text read, the abruptness of it after days of silence catching me off guard. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to decline on principle. His hot and cold behavior was exactly the kind of game I'd hoped to avoid. But another part, the part that still felt the empty echo of my apartment at night, whispered that maybe I should give him another chance. Maybe the first meeting had been a fluke, both of us too nervous to be ourselves fully. "Sure," I responded finally, curiosity winning out over caution. His next message contained an address and apartment number, no cafe or restaurant mentioned. I felt a flicker of unease as I read it, the red flag unmistakable even to someone as inexperienced with modern dating as I was. "Oh, meeting at your place? I think a public spot might be better," I suggested, trying to keep my tone light while establishing a clear boundary. "Don't worry," came his swift reply. "My floor is empty, no neighbors around. It's completely chill. You can come over." I stared at the message, debating with myself. Everything I knew about safety, everything I'd ever told my younger sister about dating precautions, screamed that meeting a near stranger at his apartment was a bad idea. But Ryan had been nothing but respectful in our conversations. We'd already met once in public without incident. And there was a part of me, a part one wasn't particularly proud of, that was curious about what his interest in me might mean after days of apparent indifference. With a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, I booked a rideshare to his address the following evening. The ride over gave me ample time to second-guess my decision, each traffic light another opportunity to ask the driver to turn around. But I didn't. Instead, I reapplied my lip gloss, checked that my location sharing was enabled with my sister, and silently rehearsed excuses to leave early if needed. The apartment building was nicer than I'd expected, a modern high-rise with a doorman who barely glanced at me as I headed for the elevators. In the confined space of the elevator, My nervousness intensified, a persistent voice in my head questioning, why am I doing this? Why am I going to this guy's house? But curiosity continued to override my caution, carrying me forward as the numbers climbed to Ryan's floor. When the elevator doors opened, I saw him waiting in the hallway outside his apartment, casual in jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He smiled when he saw me, stepping forward to envelop me in a hug that lasted a beat too long, his hands lingering at my waist as he pulled away. "You look amazing," he said, his eyes traveling from my face downward in a way that made me acutely aware of the dress I'd chosen, fitted enough to be flattering but not what I would have worn had I known we'd be alone in his apartment. The first few minutes inside were a blur of polite small talk as Ryan offered me a glass of wine and showed me around his spacious apartment. It was minimally decorated but clean, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering an impressive view of the city skyline. As we settled onto his couch, Ryan sitting close enough that our knees touched, I found myself relaxing slightly. The setting was intimate but not threateningly so, and Ryan seemed content to talk rather than immediately escalate physical contact. But as one glass of wine turned into a second, I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. His hand on my knee during a story, his arms stretched along the back of the couch behind me, each touch lingering slightly longer, becoming slightly bolder. Then, during a lull in the conversation, he leaned toward me, his intention clear in the seconds before his lips met mine. The kiss itself wasn't unwelcome. I'd wondered about it during our text conversations, had even imagined it during moments of loneliness in the weeks since our coffee date. Ryan was attractive, and the physical contact after months of solitude sent a rush of endorphins through my system that temporarily quieted my reservations. But what started as a tentative kiss quickly escalated. Ryan's hands were suddenly everywhere, at my waist, sliding up my thigh, tangling in my hair. Each movement became more insistent as he pulled me closer, his breathing quickening against my neck. "Do you want to cuddle?" he asked, his voice husky against my ear. "Yes," I replied, because the idea of cuddling, of connection without commitment, of warmth without expectation, was exactly what I thought I wanted. But Ryan's interpretation of cuddling became immediately clear as he pulled me down onto the couch, his body half covering mine, his kisses growing more demanding. I felt his hand slide under the hem of my dress, fingers tracing patterns on my inner thigh that made my breath catch. Partially in arousal, partially in alarm at how quickly the situation was escalating. When his other hand moved to my breast, squeezing with an intensity that bordered on uncomfortable, I placed my palm against his chest, creating a small space between us. "I think we should slow down," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Maybe take things a step at a time." Ryan nodded, pressing his forehead against mine in what seemed like acknowledgement. "Of course," he murmured. "We can go as slow as you want." But even as he said the words, his hands continued their exploration, as if my request had registered intellectually, but not physically. He unbuttoned his shirt, guiding my hand to his chest in a clear invitation to touch him. When I hesitated, he kissed me again, harder this time, with an edge of frustration that hadn't been there before. "I think maybe I should leave," I suggested during a brief pause for breath, the discomfort now outweighing any pleasure I'd initially felt. Ryan pulled back slightly, his expression a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Is something wrong? Did I do something to upset you?" The question made me doubt myself. Had I sent mixed signals? Was I overreacting to normal physical advances? I'd been out of the dating world for so long. Perhaps this was simply the expected pace now, and my discomfort was merely a result of my inexperience. "No, it's not that," I said, already backpedaling from my attempt to establish boundaries. I'm not sure I'm ready for this." "We're not going to have sex," Ryan assured me, his voice softening as his hand continued to rest possessively on my thigh. "Trust me." And in that moment, inexplicably, I did trust him, or perhaps more accurately, I trusted in my own ability to maintain my boundaries if things went too far. So I stayed, allowing the kissing to resume, attempting to mentally define the line between what I was comfortable with and what I wasn't. But the line kept shifting, blurring under the persistent pressure of Ryan's advances. Each time I tried to slow things down, he would pause momentarily before continuing, as if my hesitation had been merely a speed bump rather than a stop sign. His hands became more insistent, his kisses more demanding. And then, with a fluidity that suggested practiced experience, he unzipped his pants and guided my hand toward him. "Please," he said, his eyes dark with desire, his voice a mixture of demand and plea that left me frozen in indecision. "We should not have sex," I repeated with more firmness than before, trying to establish a clear boundary even as my hand remained where he had placed it. "Please," he said again, reaching for a condom from his wallet with his free hand, the action so smooth it seemed choreographed. In that moment, I felt a profound disconnect between my mind and body. My thoughts were screaming for me to leave, to assert myself more forcefully, to make it absolutely clear that this was not what I had agreed to. But my body remained motionless, paralyzed by a complex mixture of social conditioning, fear of confrontation, and the deeply internalized belief that I had somehow brought this upon myself by coming to his apartment in the first place. The next few minutes unfolded with a surreal quality, as if I were watching the scene from outside myself. Ryan's heavy breathing, the rustling of clothing, the weight of his body against mine, all registered as sensory input without emotional attachment. I didn't fight him. I didn't scream. I simply waited for it to be over, a passive participant in an act that required my enthusiasm but settled for my acquiescence. If you've been enjoying this deeply personal story about navigating the complexities of modern dating and consent, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that need to be heard. Now back to my experience. When Ryan finally rolled away, satisfied and seemingly oblivious to my emotional state, I dressed quickly, my fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers as I tried to recreate the composed person who had entered his apartment an hour earlier. "Do you want me to call you a ride?" he asked, casual now, as if what had transpired between us had been uncomplicated and mutual. "No, I'll walk," I replied, needing the physical distance more than the convenience of a car. I gathered my purse and phone, checking the time with a detached sort of surprise. How could only 90 minutes have passed? It felt like I had aged years in the span of a single evening. "Text me when you get home," Ryan said as I reached the door, the request so mundane, so normal that it struck me as almost comical in its incongruity. I nodded without looking back, unable to form words that wouldn't either dissolve into tears or erupt into accusations. The hallway outside his apartment felt expansive after the claustrophobic intimacy of the preceding hour, and I gulped the recycled air of the corridor as if it were mountain-fresh oxygen. In the elevator, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished metal doors, hair disheveled, lipstick smudged, eyes hollow but dry. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had just had sex. What the reflection couldn't show was whether that sex had been desired, whether it had been a choice freely made or a boundary gradually eroded until resistance seemed more trouble than surrender. Outside, the evening air hit me with cleansing coldness. I walked quickly, not toward the main road where I could easily find a ride, but in the opposite direction, away from Ryan's building, away from the person I had been in that apartment. 6 blocks later, when I finally stopped at a bench in a small park, the tears came, not in heaving sobs but in silent, steady streams that felt like physical relief after the emotional numbness. With shaking fingers, I pulled out my phone and deleted the dating app, erasing Ryan's number and our conversation thread in the same decisive motion. The action was largely symbolic. The memory of what had happened wouldn't be so easily removed, but it provided a small sense of reclaimed control. As I sat there in the growing darkness, I tried to make sense of what had occurred. Had I been assaulted? The question felt both enormous and inadequate. Ryan hadn't physically forced me. He hadn't threatened me. He had simply persisted, ignoring my verbal boundaries while respecting just enough of them to maintain plausible deniability. "We're not going to have sex," he had promised, right before doing exactly that. The most troubling realization, the one that kept repeating in my mind as I finally called a ride home, was how masterfully Ryan had exploited the gray area of consent, the space between enthusiastic participation and outright refusal, where social conditioning and the fear of being labeled difficult or uptight lead many women to remain silent rather than assertive. He had recognized my hesitation and used it against me, correctly betting that I would be more concerned with politeness than protection. Back in my apartment, I showered for nearly an hour, letting the hot water wash over me as if it could somehow cleanse more than just my skin. I didn't text Ryan to let him know I had arrived safely. I didn't text anyone. Instead, I wrapped myself in the comforter from my bed and sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular as I replayed the evening in my mind, searching for the moment where I should have, changed the outcome. Was it when I agreed to meet at his apartment despite my misgivings? When I didn't leave after the first kiss became too intense? When I allowed his hands to roam despite my discomfort? Or was it even earlier, when I downloaded the app in the first place, seeking connection through a medium that seemed designed to minimize humanity rather than enhance it? The questions had no satisfying answers, only the painful clarity of hindsight. What I knew with certainty was that I had encountered a man who viewed consent not as an ongoing conversation, but as an initial hurdle to be cleared, after which everything was fair game. A man who had likely done this before, and would almost certainly do it again to someone else. That thought of another woman sitting where I sat now, feeling what I felt, was what finally propelled me to action. Not legal action. I knew the complexity of proving anything in a situation that most would label a bad date, rather than an assault. But I could warn others in my circle, could share my experience, so that the women in my life might recognize the warning signs I had dismissed. The next morning, still exhausted from a night of fitful sleep, I met Jasmine and Madison for coffee before work. Their excitement at hearing about my date quickly faded as I recounted what had actually happened, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern to anger. "That's not okay," Madison said firmly when I finished speaking, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "None of that was okay." "I know," I replied, though the words felt like a half-truth. I knew it intellectually, but emotionally, I was still struggling with the weight of my own perceived complicity. "It's not your fault," Jasmine added, as if reading my thoughts. "Saying yes to a date, or a kiss, or even coming to his apartment doesn't mean saying yes to everything else. That's not how consent works." Their validation was a balm to the self-doubt that had plagued me since leaving Ryan's apartment. Here were two women who understood the nuanced landscape of modern dating far better than I did, and they were unequivocal in their assessment. I had been wronged. In the weeks that followed, I focused on healing, not just from the incident with Ryan, but from the broader sense of disconnection that had led me to seek validation through a dating app in the first place. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my relationship with Nathan, joined a book club that met weekly at a local coffee shop, and signed up for a cooking class I'd been interested in for years. Slowly, the raw edges of the experience began to soften. The memory didn't disappear, but it ceased to be the first thing I thought of when I woke up or the last thing on my mind before sleep. I found myself laughing again, genuinely, and without effort. I rediscovered the pleasure of my own company, of solitude that felt chosen rather than imposed. 6 months after my encounter with Ryan, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, it's Ryan. Been thinking about you. Want to grab a drink?" The message landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of anxiety that spread through my chest. My immediate instinct was to delete it without responding, to deny him even the satisfaction of knowing he had disrupted my hard-won peace. But as my finger hovered over the delete button, I reconsidered. Here was an opportunity, not for reconciliation or explanation, but for the kind of clarity and closure I hadn't been able to achieve that night in his apartment. With careful consideration, I composed a response. "I don't want to see you again. What happened between us wasn't consensual. I said no multiple times, and you ignored me. That's not okay. Please don't contact me again." His reply came almost immediately. "We had a good time. Don't pretend you didn't want it too." The defensive denial was exactly what I had expected, the same dismissal of my experience that had left me questioning my own feelings in the aftermath. But this time, Strengthened by months of reflection and the support of friends who had validated my experience, I didn't doubt myself. I blocked his number without further response, the action bringing a sense of finality that had previously eluded me. That evening, sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine and the novel I was currently engrossed in, I felt a subtle shift in my relationship with the memory of that night. It was still there, still a part of my history, but it no longer defined me or limited me. It was a lesson learned at too high a cost, but a lesson nonetheless, about boundaries, about trust, and about the courage required to honor both. Sex and consent both lie in a gray area, not morally or ethically, but practically, in the messy reality of human interaction where words can be misinterpreted and signals crossed. Just because I went to Ryan's apartment and wanted to kiss him didn't mean I was ready to have sex with him. I wish he had known that, or more accurately, I wish he had cared. If my story resonates with you, whether you've had a similar experience or know someone who has, please consider subscribing to support these important conversations. Your engagement helps ensure these stories reach those who need to hear them. For anyone navigating the complex world of dating apps and new relationships, remember that your boundaries matter. Your comfort matters. Your consent, enthusiastic and ongoing, matters. And anyone who suggests otherwise isn't worth your time, your attention, or your heart. The dating landscape may have changed dramatically with technology, but the fundamentals of respect and consent remain constant. No swipe, no match, no connection is worth compromising those principles. Trust your instincts, honor your boundaries, and know that you deserve nothing less than someone who will do the same. My story doesn't end with deleting an app or blocking a number. It continues every day as I relearn trust in others and in myself. It evolves as I share my experience, hoping it might serve as both warning and reassurance to others walking similar paths. And it transforms as I reclaim the narrative, refusing to be defined by one night or one person's disregard for my autonomy. This is what healing looks like. Not the absence of scars, but the strength to carry them forward, to let them inform but not inhibit, to use them as guidance rather than barriers. This is what moving on looks like. Not forgetting but integrating, weaving the difficult experiences into the broader tapestry of a life still very much in progress. And this is what I've learned. That connection, real, meaningful connection, can't be swiped right or left. It can't be rushed or forced or manipulated into existence. It emerges naturally from mutual respect, from shared values, from the sacred space created when two people truly see each other and honor what they see. I'm not against dating apps. I'm not even against taking risks to find connection in a world increasingly designed for disconnection. But I am fiercely, unapologetically in favor of boundaries, of establishing them clearly, maintaining them firmly, and surrounding yourself with people who respect them implicitly. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just the violation of boundaries, but the importance of having them in the first place. Not just the pain of being unheard, but the power of finally speaking up. Not just the damage done by one man's entitlement, but the healing made possible by my own resilience. If you take nothing else from my experience, take this. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. You matter. And anyone who makes you feel otherwise doesn't deserve a place in your story.